Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. In the past few weeks, most provinces across Canada have either announced or implemented a COVID vaccine mandate where Canadians aged 12 and older must show proof of COVID vaccination, a vaccine passport, to access certain spaces or participate in some activities. But as we enter the fourth wave of COVID, Canadians are very divided on this issue of mandating a medical treatment, the COVID jab, for Canadians, and using coercive methods and measures to achieve high vaccination rates. If you've paid attention to any of the rhetoric of the federal election in September, especially the words by our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, you've heard some very divisive and different words hurled at those against the vaccine mandate. Using words like them, mob, only helped to intensify the debate. Now, I think most Canadians are reasonable. We want good health care. We want to get out of COVID. But let's face it, with the mixed messaging we've seen throughout COVID from our political leaders and medical experts, is it any wonder why Canadians are hesitant to trust the government's plan? Especially when the science is definitely not clear that getting the COVID jab will stop the spread of the dominant Delta variant. Are vaccines still the way out of COVID? And if that is still unclear, why the mandate? And what of personal freedom? Does the government have the right to dictate to you what medical treatments you should receive? Should the government be the arbiter of your personal health care, of your children's? Should you be forced or compelled to share your personal health information with the local bartender or your movie theater? By excluding people from certain activities or areas of society, are we not creating two-tiered Canadians, those who got the jab and get to participate in society, and those who haven't and are excluded? And to what end? Will this help or hinder our fraternal fabric? Are we really all in this together? Or will the societal shunning of those who choose not to get the vaccine for whatever reason continue to damage Canada's long-earned reputation as being an open and inclusive society? Well, joining me now to help us wade through the ethics of vaccine mandates is Dr. Douglas Farrow, author, writer, and professor of theology and ethics at McGill University in Montreal. And returning is Dr. Scott Masson, tenured professor in Toronto, writer and frequent guest here on Counterpoint. Gentlemen, there's so many issues here to unpack, and I'm very pleased to have you both here to contribute because we really need to discuss the ethics of these vaccine mandates. So maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Farrow. You know, we went from 2 weeks to flatten the curve. You know, I think it's very clear we'll be 2 years into this in just a few months. You know, why now vaccine mandates?
Well, in my opinion, the vaccine passports are what this whole exercise is about. The mandates are to, are looked at on one level as an effort to prevent serious cases of COVID that require hospitalization, and so to keep pressure off the hospital system. But I do not see that as the real reason for the measures that are now being taken. We have not had overwhelmed hospitals throughout this. Even at the largest spikes, there has been room in the healthcare system and in the hospitals for those who really needed hospitalization. There would have been a lot more room had we permitted, and were we even now permitting, proper care of people when they first contract COVID, because we do have drugs that treat this very successfully in the early stages, and we have been denied the use of these drugs. Ontario, as you know, built an overflow field hospital just in case.
Right.
That seems quite prudent. But they never had to treat anyone there, just as in Manhattan during the original outbreak and in New York City, they built one and didn't have to use it. Both have been dismantled.
Right.
The simple fact of the matter is, it is not about preventing the overwhelming of hospitals. And I will tell you what I think it's about.
Okay, I'm going to pause you there, Dr. Farrow.
Yes.
We've got to cut to commercial break, but we'll come right back to you in just a few moments.
Very good. That's suspense.
Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on the ethics of vaccine passports, and joining me is Dr. Douglas Farrow and Dr. Scott Masson. Dr. Farrow, just before we went to break, you were trying to explain what this is really about. Please continue where you left off.
Yes, well, COVID has, as we know, a very low mortality rate. Over the past couple of months in Canada, you have to have 200,000 people to have one death with COVID. So again, this is not ultimately about hospitals and preventing hospitals from being overwhelmed, as we are constantly being told. The facts simply don't support that. What is it about? As far as I can make out, from the beginning, the COVID exercise has been about generating sufficient fear of what is actually a fairly manageable pathogen.
Well, you mentioned fear.
Yes, just let me complete that thought, and we can talk about the fear, because the fear is certainly something that the governments and the media have deliberately ramped up using well-known PSYOP methods and with PSYOP teams to do it. If you've read Laura Dodsworth's book, State of Fear, you'll know about that. But at any rate, the point of the exercise, as far as I can make out, is to produce a demand for the vaccines, and then to increase that demand through coercive mandates in order to get everyone into an electronic passport system, whereby biosurveillance going forward is simple for the authorities and also useful for the politicians, because movements will now be monitored. Decisions about medicine will be taken centrally rather than by individual citizens. And we're all moving forward happily into the QR-coded society.
Scott, I want to jump to you for a moment here. You know, Dr. Farrow brought up some excellent points. Privacy concerns, obviously, you know, self-autonomy, one's ability to make their own healthcare decisions. And it seems to be being eclipsed by the government saying, well, we must do this, we must do that. You know, we've seen the benchmarks move repeatedly as to when we can reopen society, first 50% and then 70%. You know, recently, Dr. Theresa Tam said that she wants to see 100% vaccination rates. How do we operate? How do we continue to Are we able to continue to be the determinants of our own health care when the goalposts keep moving?
Well, that's a great question. Karl Popper said in The Open Society and Its Enemies that we must plan for freedom and not only for security, if for no other reason that freedom can make security more secure. That's what Popper said on that historic defense of the open society, the free society. I concur entirely with Dr. Farrow. I told my son this morning, by the way, who's 6, that I was going to meet and speak with Dr. Farrow, and he asked if he was an Egyptian. I assured him that he was on the side of the slaves and not on the side of the oppressors. Yes, I think that everything that Dr. Farrow said is pertinent, relevant, and on point. The odds of a vaccinated person dying from COVID are 1 in 137,000. That's 100 times less than the flu that goes through our system on an annual basis. It seems to me that there is an agenda there, and the agenda is to expand the state and intervene in ways in our daily lives, the end of which, and it does seem to be directed by the UN through the health czars. This is a point of the story that's often been overlooked.
But Scott, you know, we have privacy rights in Canada. We have mobility rights in Canada. We have what's called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have about a minute before we go to commercial, but you know, can the government just supersede those rights?
Well, it has, so it can. Ought it to do so? Well, as you say, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms delineates the rights and freedoms that we have against the government. That's what that charter does. It says these are the rights that the state may not infringe upon, and yet it has done so. And this is the problem from the very outset, is that the state has presumed upon itself powers that it does not possess, or at least in accordance with the rules of governance that operate in our country. So at that point, we are dealing with a regime that is pronounced itself above the law. In other words, an authoritarian regime. So that is what we are facing right now. And that authoritarian regime, it appears, has just been reelected to government. So that's a problem.
Well, I've heard from so many university students and professors and college students who've been personally impacted by these mandates. And I want to get into that discussion right when we return in a few moments. Welcome back. We're picking up our discussion with Dr. Douglas Farrow and Dr. Scott Masson on the vaccine passport, the vaccine mandate, and what are the ethical issues surrounding that, the human rights issues even. I recall my days when I used to do work lobbying at the United Nations, and we used to look at other developing nations where sometimes the developed world would impose coercive methods and tie that to foreign aid, and we used to poo-poo that. Now I look at Canada and I worry about these coercive mandates or the coercion being used to bring in the vaccine mandate. I personally have heard from dozens of Canadians, university profs, teachers, university students, college students who feel coerced to violate their conscience on this matter. Dr. Farrow, should individual conscience or can individual conscience trump the collective will, which seems to be everybody should get vaccinated?
If individual conscience does not trump majority views, then the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is pointless and not worth the paper it's written on. So the answer is absolutely yes. Besides, if the vaccines were safe and effective, there wouldn't be an issue about take-up. So people who did take them up would not be anxious about people who hadn't, and the people who don't want to would be understood to have their own proper reasons. And if people don't agree with those reasons, yes, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and freedom of association, for that matter, would kick into play as it's supposed to. At the moment, I agree with Dr. Masson, we are operating in a perpetual state of exception in which constitutional rule has been suspended, rule of law has been suspended. We don't need a way out of COVID because COVID is no longer a serious problem. What is a serious problem that we need a way out of is rule by fiat instead of the rule of law.
And you mentioned that rule by fiat, and I'm not trying to alarm our viewers, but many Canadians have left and have left their home countries and come to Canada as immigrants to escape that kind of totalitarianism, that authoritarianism. My own father escaped communism to come to Canada, start a family, and live freely. And so many people have said now, well, we don't feel our conscience rights are being respected in this country. We feel with COVID, things have just been cast by the wayside. That's not why we came to Canada. We chose this life. And I worry about that. I worry about the dozens of university students I hear from. I worry about some of them who have submitted to the mandate because they feel they have no choice but to get the vaccine, or else they can't graduate from university or college, weeping, sobbing as they get the injection. And I think to myself, this shouldn't be how healthcare is delivered in Canada.
It certainly shouldn't be. And I have had stories and contacts from students and colleagues. I've also had conversations with people in healthcare and people very highly placed in healthcare who know what's going on in the hospitals. And they are also being threatened, of course, as you know, by these mandates. Our society and the government itself cannot afford to lose these people, but it's willing to lose them at the expense of patient care because it wants a universal passport system. That's the reason.
At all costs. And I've made this clear to a few people in discussing this very issue with them, Tanya, that we allegedly have mandates from government, which, as you said, are fiats. What I note to them is that we have no law on the books that says that these people must do this. The universities have, clicked their heels and fallen into line. The hospitals have done likewise. The employers are ahead of the curve on the mandates. Yet there is no legislation on the books. In Ontario, the legislature is in recess at the moment. It would take months for them to pass a bill through. Until such time, there is no law in Canada or in Ontario that would mandate that they are required to do this. So they are liable themselves for these mandates. And I think that we are going to eventually end up in the place where we are going through something in the order of Nuremberg trials once again for those who have aided and abetted this coercive regime, which violates every charter right and every ethical code that was delineated in Nuremberg right after the Nazis did exactly these sorts of things and co-opted the medical community.
Okay, well,
and every university has this code of ethics, and they willfully ignore them, and almost no professors have spoken out against it.
Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion on the ethics of vaccine passports. Will you get to access certain places if you're not vaccinated? It doesn't look like you will. There will be some restrictions across this country that have to yet be implemented if they haven't already in your jurisdiction. Dr. Masson, I want to talk about children and how they are being impacted. As parents, I'm a parent, you're a parent, we need to advocate for our children. Well, we've just seen that Pfizer has sought approval from our federal government in Canada for approval for the vaccine for 5 to 12, but we know that the vaccine, or rather that COVID, has a very little impact, if any, in terms of harms to children. Why push this vaccine? Why put a mandate on children? Scott?
Well, certainly it doesn't seem to be protection of the children that is in their minds. It's to presumably sell more vaccines, and it's also presumably to do further research trials. They might pronounce it safe on children, but they haven't been tried on children. Even though we're in the trial phase of the vaccine rollout, it has not been applied to children in any other country. But Canada seems to be as ever ahead of the curve on ways in which we ought not to be very pleased about.
So we're the only country in the world that gives it to children 12 and up presently?
To my awareness. Now, I'm not sure we do yet, but Pfizer Canada is encouraging it. And I will add this point. Pfizer does not mandate it for their own employees. That's a very interesting fact.
That is an interesting point.
Yeah, it is very interesting. The clear contradiction in what it does with its own employees and what it encourages others to do because it's safe.
Dr. Farrow, again, thinking about the children, we used to say women and children first when catastrophe was falling, and protect the women and children first. Now, with a COVID virus that, statistics and science has shown us has very little impact to children, we're saying, get the jab, which may have risks, health risks to you, and we've seen that with the myocarditis, et cetera. Is this fair for kids? Is this right? Is this just? Is this ethical?
It's criminal. It's criminal literally in the legal sense, and morally a fortiori. The experimentation on children is about the worst thing you can do in terms of medical, the violation of medical ethics. And we know that these mRNA treatments are dangerous. We don't know how dangerous or for how long. But we have absolutely no right to be using these on children. And by the way, they have begun experimenting on children in so-called trials. But how would you know the results of that for years? You wouldn't know.
You need a longitudinal study.
Yes. And so the fact that they are asking for approval of this now, so that they can begin coercing parents to give up their children to these people putting the needles in their arms is really outrageous. And frankly, Canadians need to understand that this is not about their health.
No.
It is not about their health. It is about political control, and it is about advancing technologies of biosurveillance. And if you want to see evidence of that, I'm happy to send it to you from some of the main sources, like the Wellcome Trust and the World Economic Forum,
yes,
and Gavi, the alliance, the Vaccine Alliance. You read these people, you know what they're after. They want to be able to monitor the development of fetuses in the womb and infants when they are born and young children as they grow up in order to advance their biodigital convergence agenda, which the Canadian government has invested in. And you can go on the Canadian government site and see this kind of thing being talked about.
Okay, I've got to pause you there.
Get over the fact that this is about COVID. We don't need a way out of COVID. We need a way out of authoritarian and frankly criminal governance.
Okay, I've got to stop you there. Thank you so much. Those were amazing words.
Amen.
We'll have to pick this up and maybe we'll need to do a special show on the biosurveillance. But thank you both so much for joining me today. We'll continue to monitor this issue as it develops. Definitely an eye-opening discussion. And as we can see, there are a lot of factors to consider, ethical factors, when we look at things like vaccine passports, like vaccine mandates. How they will roll out across Canada, we will see in the coming days. But for Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.